This morning we're going to begin 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to see something very similar to what we saw before. I had someone comment to me last week after the Sunday morning service that they thought I was gutsy for preaching the passage that we talked about last week. Said that they would think that some pastors would skip over such passages. And I let them know that this is why I'm committed to expositional preaching. It doesn't allow me to do such things. You have to address everything the Bible says to the extent that it addresses it, and we're not going to beat around the bush. We're going to call things what they are. And if we were a little uncomfortable last week, let's put our seatbelts on, because we're going to be more uncomfortable this week. But that's good. Because the church has been far too silent in these kind of things. These are things that we need to hear. These are things that our children need to hear. Because they need to understand these things from God's perspective. They will hear it from the world's perspective. Count on it. They need to hear these things from God's perspective. And so, inasmuch as it may make you uncomfortable and it may make me uncomfortable, we're going to press on. We're going to press on with clarity, with understanding, and with application. Last week I used the Christian Standard Bible to preach from for the sake of clarity. I'm going to continue to do that through this passage that's talking about marriage and sex and singleness. There's just some terms that I think we don't need to be sidelined by because some terms have changed. I'll give you a perfect example. In the very first verse of chapter 7, you see the phrase, not to touch a woman. Everyone see that phrase in some of the translations that you may have? That is a euphemism used during that time period. What that means is, if you were going to say, to touch a woman is to have sex. Okay? That's what that euphemism means. So, for the sake of clarity, we're just going to say, have sex. Okay? That's going to be a lot clearer for us. It's not about touching, okay? It's about physical intimacy in sex. We'll start in verse 1, and we will press through this. Similarly to how we saw that Paul was responding to some things that the Corinthian church had written him about, and there was a section of them said, all things is lawful for me. I can do what I want because of Christian liberty. And he corrected that thinking and said, no, you can't just do whatever you want because of Christian liberty. There's more to it than that. There's another group that in verse number 1 of chapter 7 you see, who is saying it is good for a man not to use a woman for sex or to touch a woman. Basically, this was another faction in the church in Corinth, and they were responding to this other faction that says we can do whatever we want in regards to sexuality because of our Christian liberty. We have a lot of that in our culture. And they not only reacted against that, they had a proper reaction saying that yes, outside marriage, sex is not good. They were reacting against the open immorality, but they also had an overreaction to the open immorality because they said that sex is always bad. They were carrying it even into marriage, saying that even within marriage, sex is not good. If you looked at the title this morning, you saw 3 specific words. There's sex, marriage, and singleness, and that's basically the outline of this passage. That's what Paul addresses. First, he says, first you need to have a somewhat biblical understanding of sex, and then we're going to talk about that in marriage, and then we're going to address the realm of singleness. So hopefully, people here this morning, all of us have some level of sexuality because we're human. All of us are probably either in the category of married or not married. So this message is for all of us. We're all going to be able to benefit from this. They're saying here, this faction in the church, sex is always bad, and even inside marriage, they're carrying it that far and saying, there is to be celibacy within marriage. Paul responds to this starting with verse 2, and he says, "But because sexual immorality is so common, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman should have sexual relations with her own husband." Okay? So this isn't Paul saying, notice the word should. Is he saying can? Well, certainly that's included, right? Can a spouse have sexual relations with their spouse? Yes. Yes, they can. Paul goes a step beyond that and even says, should. There's an aspect in which this should happen. And he says this because in the beginning of verse 2, he says, sexual desire has the potential to cause large degrees of harmfulness. That sexual desire has the possibility and potential to cause people harm. Sexual immorality in the church in Corinth and in the culture in which they lived was rampant. I would say that it was worse off, much worse off than our culture today. And yet, if you would ask the average Christian today, is sexual immorality rampant in our culture today? Most of us would answer, yeah, most definitely. Yes, it is. Still not quite as bad as what it was for the church in Corinth, but because there is some level of comparison, I think we can learn a few things from them. He bases this somewhat on the culture, and he says, we need to look at the danger that is outside of us and how prevalent this unbiblical line of thinking about sex is. And we need to guard against that, and one way of guarding against that is your marriage and the relations that you are able to have with your spouse within marriage. He basically says this. He says, you need to have sex with your spouse. That should happen. That should be a thing. God has given a place for open sexual expression in marriage. And unlike what this faction of the church is trying to promote, saying that sex is always immoral, Paul is not only saying that sex in marriage is not immoral, he's saying that sex within marriage guards against immorality. It helps protect against immorality. Isn't it interesting that culture has drastically twisted sexual freedom? If someone says, if you are referring to whether or not this person is single or married, and someone in larger culture says, oh no, I'm free, do they mean they're single or do they mean that they're married? They typically mean that they're single. And singleness tends to be viewed as that place where I am sexually free to practice whatever I choose. And yet, that is completely contrary to the biblical model of sexuality. Most people think of the phrase sex in marriage as a very binding and constricting thing, and it's not. God designed marriage to allow for freedom of sexual expression, and that is the place where it is good and appropriate and right. Not outside of marriage. God's given a designated place for that. And so we need to counterculturalize our own minds in thinking about it, because we need to be thinking of being free to express oneself sexually happens within marriage, not when one is single. In verse number 3, he moves on from this general talk about sex, and he really dives into marriage. How does this work in marriage? What are some specific things that we need to think of about marriages in regards to sexual relations? Verse 3, a husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise, a wife to her husband. The principle that he's going to promote here is going to be this. If one spouse desires sex, both husband and wife should be seeking to fulfill that desire. Let me say it again. If one spouse desires sex, both husband and wife should be seeking to fulfill that desire. In verse number 3, he points to sex and connects it directly to your marriage vows. Connects it straight to the marriage covenant itself. Do you see that? He calls it a marital what? A marital duty. A duty. Now, how many of us like to do things out of duty? But how many of us have duties that can also be a joy? We all have those as well. And so just because he's calling it a duty does not mean that it cannot be enjoyable, okay? But it is connected to our marriage covenant. And so I'd say it like this. Sex within marriage is a reminder and renewal of the marriage vows you took when you committed to sacrifice your whole self for the good of your spouse. It's that reminder, that renewal of, yes, I am continually willing to sacrifice my whole self, like I said I was when we were married, for the good of my spouse. And I'm willing to do that continually. That's a very positive look. That's what we should be thinking. But I think because we are so unwilling to talk about this, we need to think about it from the other direction as well. A man or woman who continually refuses to have sex with their spouse is a man or woman who is failing to keep their marriage vows. Period. That's just straight. If sex within marriage is that connected to the marriage covenant itself, then refusal on that front continually is living in unfaithfulness to the very vows that you gave to one another. That's important. And I know that some would downplay its importance, but Paul certainly doesn't. And get this, Paul's single. And yet he even understands that this is so connected to the vows that one takes in marriage and the importance that it is. In verse 4 of chapter 7, we talk about ownership of the body, and it says a wife does not have the right over her own body, but her husband does. In the same way, a husband does not have the right over his own body, but his wife does. There's a self-sacrifice going on continually within a marriage, and this is a small picture of what ought to be happening in a much greater extent. Does that make sense? But if it's not happening here, I think it's very appropriate to question whether or not it's happening elsewhere in the marriage. In marriage, you give yourselves to one another. However, I want to pause and address something here that I don't want anyone to confuse. Yes, husbands, you don't have the right over your body, your wife does. Wives, you don't have the right over your body, your husband does. However, this in no way justifies any abuse of any kind. And just so we're clear, sexual abuse can happen within marriages. And it does happen within marriages. And it is wrong and it is sinful. So I'm going to give you 3 ways that abuse might happen. Sexual abuse could happen within a marriage. 1, physically forcing sex is always wrong and is abuse. It is sin. Anytime you are physically forcing someone to have sex, that's abuse. I don't care if you're married or not. That's abuse. Demanding sex is always wrong and is abuse. 3, manipulating for sex or manipulating to get out of it is always wrong and is abuse. forcing, demanding, manipulating have no part in that remembrance and renewal of the marriage covenant. When those things enter the picture, we're not talking about a beautiful gift from God. We're talking about abuse. And it's wrong and it's sinful. That may not be the only reason that a married person may feel that their intimacy with their partner is not enjoyable. And so I would say that any married person that feels as if they have to endure sex with their spouse for any reason, you need to get some counsel, get some help. That's not a state in which you should have to live. That may be abuse and that needs to be addressed, but it may be more medical. On our bookshelf, there's a great book that I typically recommend for people right before they get married. Not too far before, which is why I don't leave it out on the bookshelf. If you want it, you have to ask me or Grace, and we'll get it out of the office to give it to you. But it's called Intended for Pleasure. Written by a strong Christian man who's also a medical family practitioner, family doctor. If you're not sure about what you are experiencing in your marriage as far as your sex life, this would be a great starting place. I don't know who I want to talk to. I don't know if I want to talk to anybody, but I can read some things. And if you're too embarrassed to ask me or Grace to get it for you, Amazon is your friend. They'll deliver it right to the door. And the mailman will not open the package before he drops it off, okay? Before you have to sign for it. Intended for Pleasure by Ed Wheat. By Ed Wheat. But it is there and available if you want to ask for that and to read some of that. Very helpful book. There's really one exception from the principle of if one spouse is desirous of sex, then both should be seeking that. Here's the one exception that we find in verse number 5, and it really is fasting from sex. It's really using that sexual desire to break for a time of fasting or focusing on prayer. Let's read verse 5. It says, "Do not deprive one another, except when you agree for a time to devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, otherwise Satan may tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So I'm going to define fasting for us. I would define fasting this way. Fasting is using a natural physical desire to remind us of the intense need we have of God and the all-consuming desire we ought to have for Him. Does that make sense? When you're fasting, you're giving up something that you're going to have a physical desire for. Typically, we think of fasting as giving up what? Food. You're going to stop eating. What happens when you don't eat for a while? You get hungry. Your body tells you, hey, you want food. There's something you want. And fasting is using that naturally occurring physical desire to remind you of the intense need that we have of God. Not food. We need food physically, but we need God eternally more. And we ought to be desiring Him eternally more, much more than any physical desire could ever make us desire anything. And so it's using that physical desire to remind us of the intense need we have for God and the all-consuming desire we ought to have for Him. Now, that's typically what we think of is fasting from food, but can you see how the same principle can apply if a couple would decide to fast from sex for a time? The same kind of principles would apply. This is the one exception to the rule of fulfilling sexual desire within marriage. This is the one thing that Paul says. Here's the exception. And it's using it to focus on the Lord. However, even within the exception, he gives some qualifications. First, you see that in verse 5, they have to be mutually agreed upon. All right? So it's no fair for one spouse to decide that I'm going to fast from sex for a week and not tell my spouse. That doesn't work. That's not nice. It needs to be mutually agreed upon. Not just informing your spouse, but them to agree to it. It needs to be mutually agreed upon. It says for a time. It shouldn't be indefinite. It should be very clear from the very beginning of when are we starting and when are we stopping this. Okay? And when that ends, what's the command in the verse that you're supposed to do when that fast ends? What are you to end the fast with? They say it nicely, don't they? Come together again. Okay? What that means is celebrate the ending of the fast. Okay? The fast should end with a specific set time to give an official end of the fast together. And why does he say this? Why does he give all of these qualifications, even when your purpose is really to focus in on the Lord and to really push yourself to desire him more and to seek him more? Well, he says, because Satan can so easily gain a foothold here. It's so very easy for Satan to use the natural desires of our bodies to gain a grip on us and not let us go. It's dangerous. And so it needs to be treated with great, great caution. Now, he doesn't command you to fast from sex ever. But he says, if you're going to, here's your qualifications. So all of this talk about marriage and sex, and I see a few single people out there going, so what about me? So what am I supposed to do with all of this? Well, Paul feels for you as well. And so in verse number 6, he says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. All this idea of have sex in marriage, have sex with your spouse, it's a concession. It's not a command. You have to understand that in the Old Testament, singleness was actually highly looked down upon. Think about it. Think about even what you know from the patriarchs. When the wives of the patriarchs felt forgotten of the Lord, it was because of what reason? They had no children. Children in the Old Testament, having children or not having children, was directly linked in people's minds with either being blessed by God or maybe even cursed by God. So it was one thing to be married and have no children, but then to not even be married? That was highly looked down upon. And some coming out of Judaism that were in the church in Corinth, you can understand how some might carry over that line of thinking. And what Paul is saying, and I think he's a great person to be saying this as a single man himself who's an apostle, he's saying singleness is not prohibited. We're not saying you have to go get married. But in verse 7, he does say that singleness, long-term singleness, does take a particular gifting, is what he calls it. He says in verse 7, I wish that all people were as I am, single, but each has his own gift from God. One person has this gift, another has that gift. People talk about the gift of singleness. And can I say this too? I am not convinced that the gift of singleness is a lifelong gift. How many of us were single for a time? Oh, good. Every hand's up. We weren't born married. That would be weird. So for a time, all of us enjoyed the gift of singleness. And later on in the book, he's going to go into the benefits of being single and how that enables us to actually follow God more devotedly. So he's not trying to condemn singleness in any way by what he's saying. Not in any way. Singleness is a particular gifting from God and may not be for your entire life, but for as long as it is, fine. Fine. In verse 8, he gives some instructions for singles, and he specifically includes widows in this. He says, I say to the unmarried and to widows, it is good for them if they remain as I am. It's good. It's not bad. It's good. It's fine. Contentment in your current state is good and acceptable. Some people may get the idea of that everyone wants to get married, and maybe I just don't have interest in that. It's just not something that really gets me excited. That's okay. It really is. It's okay. There's no reason to feel guilty if you're happy single. There's no reason to feel incomplete or less of a human being if you're single. And God has a specific purpose for you in your singleness. Otherwise, Paul wouldn't even be addressing this as having a particular gifting in your singleness. You know, there's ways in which you can serve the Lord as a single person that it's very difficult for married people to serve in those capacities. It just is. There are ways in which you can do that, and opportunities that you can take advantage of that are more difficult once you're married. In verse 9, but if they do not have self-control, they should marry, since it is better to marry than to burn with desire, or to burn with passion. And so here's the principle he's laying out. It's fine to be single. There's no need to feel guilty about being single. You're not incomplete if you're single. You're a fully fledged human being, child of God, servant of the Lord, to be respected on the same plane as anyone who is married. However, if sexual desire is a potential hazard for you personally, pursue marriage. Pursue marriage. Because marriage gives you some guards against immorality. If you struggle because of your sexual desire, you need to seek marriage. But if you struggle because of your sexual desire, seek to desire God more, right? This isn't a scapegoat saying, don't worry about fighting your sexual impulses, just look for someone to get married to. That's not what I'm saying at all. And that's not what Paul's trying to say. Obviously, the Christian's duty is always to seek to desire God more than all things, so that our desires for things of this life will fade away. But inasmuch as we seek to desire God, he says, pursue marriage, seek marriage. And I think that we need to carry this over into today's dating relationships. Because in our dating relationships today, they're seen somewhat as the same idea as marriage. If you're dating someone, you're married to them. And so anything goes. And that's not biblical. It's not biblical. So I'd say this to those who are single: fight to maintain purity in dating. And what I mean by purity is not just don't do the final act of sex. Okay? You need to fight to maintain purity. And I phrase it that way intentionally. It's not fighting to stay away from sex, so I'm going to stop right there. It's maintaining purity. Maintaining a heart in which, in any given moment with you and the person that you are dating, you are always pointing them closer to Jesus. Is that fair to say? You're just always pointing them closer to Jesus. And we could get into how far is too far and all this kind of conversation, but it's really the wrong conversation. Are you pointing them to Jesus? That's the right conversation. Because that's what you want in a spouse, right? If you're going to marry someone, you want to marry someone who is going to be constantly pointing you to Jesus, not seeking their own selfish desires or allowing you to fulfill your selfish desires. That's not what you want. Someone to point you to Jesus. Principle number 2, keep marriage as the goal of dating. When your goal of a date becomes to go have a good time, is that really a good a good reason to be dating someone? I don't think so. The reason you date someone is because you're saying, I am specifically going to spend time with this individual in order to make a decision on whether I can marry this person or not. And once you've made that decision, go to it. If you know, I'm not going to marry this person, I just enjoy hanging out with them, stop dating them. Okay? You are literally wasting your time. If you're dating someone and you both know and you guys have verbalized, like, we want to get married. Can I say it this way? Go get married. This year-long engagement stuff is for the birds. It's ridiculous. You've made a decision that you two are going to commit your lives to one another. You know and are anticipating the day that the two become one flesh. And now you've made a decision, but let's set a timer for 1 year, and let's just hold off for a year. That's not how this works. It's not how this works. Once engaged, decision is made. Do not artificially prolong engagements. Right? Don't artificially prolong engagements. I understand there's life things that sometimes happen, right? Maybe someone has to finish school, or someone has to do this, or someone, whatever. Takes a little time to plan a wedding, maybe. But don't artificially prolong engagement. There's absolutely no reason for it. You know, a pastor that I respect a lot, he's pastored a large church in Southern California, the same church, for 50 years. You ever heard the name John MacArthur? Can you imagine how many weddings that John MacArthur has been a part of in his 50 years of ministry in the same church? You're probably talking like multiple generations of marriages at this point. He states the same principle, but he says it this way. He says, the practical problems of an early marriage are not nearly as serious as the danger of immorality. The practical problems of an early marriage are not nearly as serious as the danger of immorality. So fight to maintain purity in dating. Keep marriage as the goal of dating. And once you've made your decision, act on it. Go to it. Either get married or stop dating, because the decision's made. That is the end of the dating relationship. These are things this morning that our culture wants us to think and to act and to believe things that are very contrary to everything that we've talked about this morning. This is not a popular message. I don't enjoy this message personally because some of the lack of conversation that we even have about these topics. But I firmly believe that our openness in these kind of conversations drastically needs to change as churches in America. Because we have let young people grow up for decades getting all of their education from the world. And they think that Christians are just so sexually restrictive. It's all about what you can't do. But God says, no, I have created you to be sexually expressive in the bounds of marriage, and there is an appropriate place for that. There's a freedom there. And it should be good and enjoyable for both spouses. And so we should be seeking that in our marriages. We should be respecting that as singles, with the knowledge that it's not bad that I'm single, but if this is going to be a stumbling block for me, then I should pursue marriage, because that's one of the purposes that God created marriage for. We need to think appropriately and biblically about this. And I pray that as we learn to think biblically about this, and God continually corrects our thinking through His Word, that our actions will be different, that we will then be able to take these messages and teach them better to our children, help children to have a proper view of these things. And it doesn't start at 13. It starts a lot younger than that. Let's pray together this morning. Father, we do thank you for what you have given to us, even in the gift of sexual intimacy. We thank you that you've given Paul such explicit words, the message of which is much needed in the day of the church in Corinth, but is also much needed for us today. We need to make sure that we maintain a biblical thought about sex, marriage, and singleness, and how those things interact together. I pray that these principles would sit on our hearts, that we would make decisions based on these things, and that we would instruct our children to think along these lines, along the lines of these principles, so that they too may be faithful to you in this area that is so difficult to be faithful to you in our current culture. I pray these things in your name. Amen. Let's stand together, and we're going to close by singing 597, Take My Life and Let It Be, verses 1 and 5.